Podcasts are pretty common. So what makes the Uncommon podcast uncommon? Well, it's all in our name. I'm your host, Noah Weiss, and we at Uncommon Sports Group understand the unique pressures and temptations that come with a career in the sport industry. We provide uncommon training that helps you successfully navigate common challenges. Hit the follow button on this podcast. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Check out our website and become uncommon. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Uncommon Podcast. I'm your host, Noah Weiss, and I'm excited to welcome Jennifer Callinan and Emily Reinert on the show today. Jennifer is the Director of Career Services and Relations with Gopher Athletics, and Emily is the Director of Student Athlete Development with Gopher Athletics as well. And they will be sharing with us how to best prepare for an interview. Jen and Emily, how are you?
Doing great. Noah, how are you?
Doing great. Glad to have you guys on today. And Jen and Emily, let's start by discussing what are some of the key things to do before going into an interview.
Great question. So I would definitely recommend thinking about how you're going to prepare for the interview, having that job description right at your fingertips, so you can pull from examples from the description and use your own experiences to match those examples from the job description. Also get the job description right away. Save that so that you don't have to go back and ask for it later, because that might not look as good.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and you can use that job description as a guide as how you will prepare, because you never know what they're going to ask you or exactly how they're going to ask it, but you can guess from the job description what kind of skills and qualities they're looking for in a candidate. So you're going to look through that and make sure that you have lots of stories and examples from past experiences that match or are similar to the types of things that they're looking for.
Yeah.
One of the main strategies that is really popular when you're preparing to think through some of these examples and kind of talk them through is called the STAR method. And that's really popular because it's so easy to outline your thoughts and make sure that you have just the right amount of information. And so for those that don't know what this is, STAR stands for situation, task, action, and result. So the situation and the task are really providing context, where and when and what you were tasked with. And then the action is that what you did. How did you accomplish the task? How did you solve the problem? And then the results are just finishing up the story with some positive outcomes that came from those actions.
Yeah, absolutely.
And also another really helpful tip would be ask questions. Have some questions in advance before the interview, and several questions, more than you would actually need to ask. Yeah. Because you never know, the interviewer might already answer some of those questions within the interview. So, and you can think of them in two categories. So you could think of it as job specific questions, things that that show that you're interested in that specific position. Another way to ask questions would be an organizational, like asking about the organization, the company, showing that you're interested in the company as a whole. And it's always helpful to have at least 3 or 4 of those questions at the end of the interview.
Yeah, absolutely, Jen and Emily. And I appreciate you guys sharing. I think really the highlight of what you guys said is to be prepared. I think that is really the key. I think, Jen, going off what you said in terms of having some understanding and to ask the questions about the organization, I think even researching the organization is something that is huge, coming in with the knowledge and understanding of what they stand for, what they're about, where they've been, and where they're going. I think really can help you stand out, especially in the sports landscape. There's so many different organizations that have different past success stories, different things they're trying to do in the future, and it's key to come in understanding those things. So I appreciate you guys sharing. Definitely preparation is key. So I appreciate those points. That's awesome.
Absolutely.
And what are some of the most common interview questions that our listeners should be prepared for?
This is something a lot of people ask about. It's like, what should I expect.
Yeah.
And almost every interview you ever go on is probably going to start with some version of tell me about yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny because most people don't prepare for that because they say, oh, well, that's pretty easy.
Yeah.
But it's something that you can definitely have a strong or a weak first tell me about yourself answer.
Yeah.
And so I recommend putting some thought into how you would describe yourself at the beginning of an interview. It's your chance to really start off strong and set the tone for the rest of the interview.
Yeah.
And there's a little formula that I follow to answer this one. And you can think about it in 3 sections. So who you are professionally now.
Yeah.
And so like, what is it that's most impressive about you right now? That could be your current job title. It could be that you're graduating with a particular degree, something that relates to the thing that you're applying for.
Yeah.
And then the second part is going to be 2 to 4 reasons why you're qualified, why you're a good fit. So sharing a couple experiences from your past that relate to this position. And finally, the third part is just 1 to 2 sentences about why you're excited about the opportunity. And so the whole answer should take about 2 minutes or so. So you're not going into incredible detail about your whole life story. You're keeping it really professional, keeping it concise. And then throughout the rest of the interview, you'll have a chance to go into more detail.
Love that. Love that.
Another not so common anymore question is, what are your weaknesses?
Yeah.
So that can come up, and it's always best to be ready for that question just in case it does come up.
Yep.
But it's good to talk about an area for growth more than it would be talking about a strength, but masking it as a weakness.
Yep.
Like, oh, I'm just too much of a hard worker, and I always get to, so much work done. You don't want to do that. You want to sound authentic and genuine. So something you might, for an example, you might talk about, public speaking if you're having a hard time with that. You can talk about that as a growth area and how you've worked with your current supervisor to develop that skill by giving feedback, and coming up with strategies to practice those skills. So what's important is just really discuss like the follow-up steps you're taking to develop that area. So it's a weakness, but it's an appropriate weakness for the position.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those are 2 tremendous points. I think the tell me about yourself question seems easy, kind of like you said, Emily, but you start kind of going through it and you're like, oh wait, I have a lot to tell. I don't know if I can break it down into 2 minutes. So I think that's huge to really prepare for that question. And I think the 3 key points you gave were huge. And then on the point of the weaknesses, I was always told coming through school that you should never say you have none. I think it's important, honestly, to be honest about what some weaknesses you have are. I think that shows that you are somebody that is looking to grow, kind of like you said, Jen, that there's that growth pattern through your life, and we all have weaknesses, so admitting those, I think, is a key part of that. Those are great points. I love that.
Yeah.
And what are some of the key items that employers look for in a resume that would make a candidate really stand out in an interview?
Well, the first part is pretty simple. Just making sure you have your correct contact information. Some people forget to look at that and really make sure everything's in one line, even and that you have even your voicemail isn't full. That's another funny thing that you wouldn't really think about, but it's common. It happens. Yeah.
Totally.
So, and your voicemail greeting too. It's appropriate. You have your name in there. Your email address is professional and it has your name in some way, shape, or form. So, those are a couple, simple, easy, low-hanging fruit kind of things that you want to make sure right there on your resume.
Yeah.
Another thing with the resume is to make sure that it's tailored to the specific position that you're applying for. And writing a resume isn't easy. So I always recommend getting help from somebody that knows a lot about resumes. And that's important too. A lot of people have opinions about resumes, but there are fewer people that really know how to write a good resume. So my tip and suggestion is if any of our listeners are either in college or recently graduated from college, your college career center is always available and has lots of resources and people to help you with that. but you really want to make sure that the language you're using on your resume speaks to the language that the job is using in their job description. And so an example that you might have a lot of references on your resume to working with a team or being on a team, but the job description talks about collaboration across departments. And so you could then take your language and translate it into something like you collaborate with team members, coaches, and administrators to common goal. Something like that, something simple to tweak the language just so that it's very easy to see at a quick glance that you have the same skill set that they're looking for.
Yeah, absolutely.
You can go back to your college career center too, believe it or not, after you graduate and utilize them again. So if you are rusty on your resume skills, go back and see them and they'll be happy to help.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the point about the Career Center is huge. It's available, it's there, especially for our listeners that are in the college stage of their lives. It's something to take advantage of for sure. It can be hard to write a resume that is supposed to be what it is, and have the correct professional design to it. So I think that's huge. As well as I think tailoring the resume is really important, especially to that job description. As you mentioned earlier, it's really important to understand what the job description is and to prepare accordingly, but especially in terms of the resume, I think that was a tremendous tip. So I appreciate you guys sharing that. Awesome. And one big thing, especially for students that are in this generation, it is common for organizations to look at interviewees' social media accounts. So what can our listeners do to make sure that their social media accounts won't put them in a bad place with an organization?
Well, it is funny because the Facebook, for example, came out when I just finished college, and it was already a big deal back then. Yeah. So yeah, it's very common for employers or for organizations to look you up on social media, and they do want to do that. So Google yourself, first of all, just Google yourself and see what comes up. Yeah. Watch out for personal details, so kind of tamp down what you're putting out there on your social media, like privacy settings, things like that. It's okay to have a social media account. Totally. And it's okay to be out there, but it just look at what you can see when you look at yourself from a third party perspective, for example. Yeah. And it's important for hiring managers and recruiters to not have that much personal information about you. Yeah. But again, it is okay to have something out there about yourself.
Yeah, totally. That's great advice.
Yeah. Another tip is just to add professional, a professional version of yourself out there into the mix by creating a nice LinkedIn profile, so that when employers are looking you up and Googling you, that professional face of that you're putting out there on LinkedIn is something that comes up that they can then look at. Yeah. You don't have to have as many privacy settings because that's going to have your resume information and all that good stuff out there. So you're adding to the mix, and then they'll be able to see that, yes, you have, all the others, but they don't necessarily have to see all your videos and your pictures.
Absolutely. Yeah, two tremendous points. And I think it is unique in terms of this generation to have to handle those interesting details that could come with social media. But I think a really key point, privacy settings are huge. One thing I discuss a lot with our students is it's important to really keep your personal relationships and different dramas in your life really off your social media pages, so those aren't on blast for people to see. And so I think that's an important note as well, is to truly just keep the important things about your life on social media, but keep a lot of what you're going through personally just within yourself and people that you care about. And I do think LinkedIn is a massive, massive piece of advice. I appreciate you sharing that, Emily. And I think it is something that if you utilize it well, it can be a huge plus for you professionally. And I think it's a great way to make relationships too. I think even beyond that, to connect with somebody you interviewed with after the interview via LinkedIn, I think is huge, and sending a personalized note, things of that nature. So great points. And I think those are very valuable tips. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely.
And a looming question for young professionals is, what do I wear going into an interview? So what is the expectation for guys and gals in terms of what they should wear going into an interview?
This is always a hard question. And even me, someone that coaches on interviews, I have to stop and think like, okay, well, what am I wear to this interview,
Yeah.
do a little research ahead of time. So you can look up the company on LinkedIn, you can look at their website to get a sense of their level of professionalism.
Yeah.
Because depending on the type of company it is, the industry you're going into may be a bit more casual than, say, like a financial institution is going to be super professional.
Yeah.
So just kind of figure out their day-to-day level of professionalism and then step it up for the interview.
Yeah.
So that could mean if they're business casual, on most days for your interview, you're going to be a little bit more business professional. That might mean wearing, a sport coat or a suit. It might mean wearing a blouse and a blazer,
Yeah.
just to step it up a little bit than their kind of typical day to day.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that applies to virtual interviews as well. So
Yeah.
in person or virtual, you want to make sure that you're dressed professionally and kind of leaning on the conservative side. So not a lot of jewelry or a lot of bright colors or patterns, because you really want the focus on what you're saying and not what you're wearing.
Absolutely. That's great.
And you don't even have to be new to interviewing to struggle with that. I interviewed for the position I'm in now with athletics here, and I was like, should I wear my athletics wear or should I wear a blazer? It always comes up, and it's important. But I had somebody to give me some feedback, so I think I did okay.
Absolutely. No, I love those points, especially I think in terms of the virtual interview, because it can be tough with those. You're like, well, I don't know, I'm just going to be on Zoom. So I think that's very vital tips there. I do want to share an anecdotal story in terms of what to wear in an interview. I was a basketball manager at Butler University for 4 years, and when I went in for the interview, I was unsure what to wear. Obviously, kind of like you said, Jen, it's a sports team, so do I wear sporting gear or do I wear something that's uber professional? And I decided to go the professional route. I wore a suit, and I walk in, and the two people interviewing me just had sweats and a hoodie on. So I was overdressed, but later I learned that one of the reasons I got hired was because of what I was wearing was professional, and it showed that I was going to be prepared and ready. So I always think about that. I was overdressed, but it did pay off in the end in terms of kind of showing the level of preparation I had for the interview. So I think for our students listening, you might feel like you're overdressing, especially for them as they want to work in the sports industry, but I think it's better to overdress than it is to underdress. So key points. Appreciate you guys sharing there. It's good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And really one key part to an interview is selling yourself, but it can be tough to balance being too arrogant or cocky. So share with us, what is the best way to sell yourself to an interviewer without being cocky or arrogant?
Yeah, for sure. It's actually almost more common to sell yourself short in an interview. It's because it's not that natural, to talk about yourself in a positive light in front of others. And so it is good to focus on your strengths and experiences, give examples in a positive light. Of course, I don't believe it comes off really braggy or cocky or arrogant if you're focusing on, the position at hand and how you've done work that relates to that position, and if you're prepared, as we talked about at the beginning, you'll already have these examples ready to go, and it will become a little more natural for you to discuss that. So I think just again focusing on your strengths and how you've done a good job and giving examples in the past and how excited you are to work for them will still come off as genuine and authentic more often than not.
Absolutely. It's awesome.
Yeah,
no, I think too it's interesting to think about that reality of it's something you should be doing is bragging about yourself in an interview in a way that, as you said, relates to the job. But I think that's really key. I think for our listeners to not feel bad about doing that. Obviously, as you mentioned earlier, talking about your weaknesses is part of it in most interviews, but I do think it's something that it's okay to talk about yourself. That's why you're in there. That's why it is an interview. They want to see what your skill sets are. They want to see what you've done and past experiences you've had. So I think for our listeners, not feeling bad about talking about themselves and being excited to share about themselves, because that's really the whole point of the interview is to have the interviewer to get a better view of you. So I think those are great points there. Appreciate you sharing.
Yeah.
I think an undervalued part of interviews is body language and tone of voice. I think those are something we don't often think about, but have some value. So share with us kind of what advice you would give our listeners in regards to keeping those two items in check during the interview.
That can be really hard if you're the type of person that gets nervous, which most people do, get nervous before an interview.
Yep.
Focused on what am I saying, how am I saying it, and it's hard to be cognizant of your body language or your tone of voice. Yeah. And that's where preparation comes in. If you can do some practice ahead of time, record yourself. Yeah. Take a look at what you look like, what you sound like as you're talking through your examples and sharing your stories. Yeah. You might notice that you are talking too fast or you're talking too loud or, whatever happens when you're a little bit more anxious, those things tend to exaggerate. Yeah. And so that once you're aware of it, you can kind of keep that in check. Totally. When it's time, you're in the interview, you, as much as you can, try to be as natural as you can and kind of breathe through those nerves and focus on what they're saying and not just thinking about what you're going to say. So be listening and sharing and trying to be as natural as you can. Remember to make eye contact. If you're, sometimes you'll have a committee interview, so it'll be more than one person. Yeah. And so you make sure that you're making eye contact around the room and looking at everyone when you're talking. Yep. It's okay after a question is asked to take a moment, take a breath, kind of collect your thoughts, and then start talking. And that can kind of help to gather yourself before you launch into your answer. Yeah. Just remember to smile and breathe. If you do stumble, if you make a mistake, if you forget part of the question, it's actually like proven that people find you more relatable, more likable. So if you can kind of roll with it and laugh at yourself and move on and recover well, that's really a positive thing in an interview. So that can take some of the pressure off that you don't have to be perfect if you can kind of roll with it and move on.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great advice. Great advice. Yeah, and I think too, what's like kind of going off your point about really just rolling with the mistakes. I think it's really part of the deal is you're going to mess up at some point. I don't think anybody's perfect in an interview. And if you are, that's awesome. But most of us are not perfect in interviews. So I think that's key is to be just okay with that. It's not about being perfect. It's about doing your best. And I think if you're putting off that you are trying to share and be as authentic as possible, I think kind of like you said, Emily, it's relatable. So I appreciate you sharing. That's great stuff right there. And lastly, Jen and Emily, what are some tips you would give in regards to following up with an organization after the interview?
Excellent question. Well, it may be common or obvious, but thanking them, thanking the people you interview with, every single person that you spoke with, at least 24 hours after the interview. Yeah. Email is fine. You do not have to write a handwritten thank you note, but if you do and send it, which it may not make it to that person very quickly, but you should still follow up with a thank you email. Yeah. And it's fine to do that and restate your interest in the position and, kind of maybe even restate why you're interested, or highlight why you're a good fit is what I mean. Yeah. And hopefully that you'll hear from them soon. Totally. And it kind of depends on how you left the interview. If they just talked about, timeline and when you'll hear back, and that how that relates to the timing of your thank you note as well. Yeah. So if they say, we'll get back to you in a week, give it some time as well. And before you follow up again, if you haven't heard anything, give them that piece of time. Because it always takes longer than you would think for them to get back to you. Sometimes it can be pretty slow, but and also when you're doing that thank you piece, keep it brief and concise. It's still part of the application materials. So you want to continue to be professional in that as well. And every time I've interviewed for a position, I've done a thank you email, and I don't know, it feels good. It feels good to have that end piece there, and that you're recognizing that you're thanking them for their time as well. Yeah,
absolutely.
And it's more important than you think. A lot of people forget that It's a simple action that you can do that makes you just stand out from the rest. And it's just a nice thing to do. So like Jen said, within 24 hours, send that thank you email right away. And then if they haven't provided a timeline by the end of the interview, like around the time you're asking them questions, it's okay to ask them at the end of the interview what their timeline is, their expected timeline to make a decision, so that you can take a mental note. And if they say we're interviewing through the week, we'll get back to people early next week. Well, by early next week, midweek, if you haven't heard from them, it's appropriate to reach out one time to thank them again and just check in on their timeline.
Yeah, no, I think those are two awesome points. And I think this is probably one of the most undervalued portions of the interview process is the follow-up. I don't think a lot of young professionals see that. And for our listeners, I hope they did take away from you guys' points on the email. I think that's huge to send that thank you email right away, as you said, within the first 24 hours. And I think even too, if there's an address provided, I think a handwritten thank you note even adds another level of personal touch. I know a few sport professionals that I've connected with that actually have a drawer in their desks with all the thank you notes they've received. So that can provide a whole new level of remembering somebody's name. Maybe down the line, if there's another opportunity, they'll remember your note and reach back out. So small things like that are huge. And then, asking about the timeline. I think we often feel like it's an out-of-bounds question, but it's not. I think it's very fair, and I think every interviewer will be okay to share that timeline. So great points, and I appreciate it, and I think that's a very valuable piece to the interview process. So I appreciate you guys sharing.
Sure.
And Jen and Emily, thank you for joining the show today to share your insight on interviews, and we wish you both well.
Great. Thank you, Noah.
Thanks for having us.
If you want to get involved with Uncommon Sports Group and the mission that we are on to help you navigate the sport industry as followers of Christ, apply for our academy on our website at uncommonsg.org. That's uncommonsg.org. Be sure to catch new episodes of the Uncommon podcast every Thursday at midnight Eastern Time, as well as the full video episodes on our YouTube channel. Until next time, we pray that you will strive to be uncommon by glorifying the name of God in whatever you may do. See you next week.